Hello, my name is Larry Arnstein. Thank you for tuning in to learn about RFID for retail, what many are calling the second major tagging revolution. By way of introduction, these pictures of the New York City Marathon show as many as 45,000 people wearing an RFID enabled, powered by Impinj RFID tag that checks their timing throughout the course and even provides data and visibility to friends and loved ones as people run. Along with race timing, our technology wide variety of other very exciting and interesting applications that are improving people's lives in many different ways. For example, RFID technology from Impinj is being used to manage and track inventory of medical equipment and perishable supplies. For fancy new Coke machines that manage the consumables in unique ways that enable a new kind of consumer experience. Trash collection service verification, and a whole variety of other applications, including, of course, retail, which we're here to talk with you about today. To start our discussion of RFID and retail, I'd like to present for you first this stylized map of a retail store. We have the front store, the back room, the point of sale, exit gates, fitting rooms, and receiving. And before there was barcodes, you might say that the entire operation of a retail store was enshrouded in what you might call the fog of retail. And along came barcodes, which were really quite a wonderful thing because they served to at least clear up the fog around what's happening at the point of sale. The barcodes have lots of really interesting strengths that made them very usable in this context. They're inexpensive, they're faster for data entry than doing it by hand on a cash register, and it's based on printing technology, which, even though the printing technology of the day was not quite up to the requirements of barcodes, it was a paradigm that people understood and could use. So this technology really was quite effective at illuminating and speeding up that operation of the point of sale in retail across the board, and it was widely adopted, although it took many years for that to happen. I'd like to compare that with RFID technology, which serves to clear out the fog of the rest of the operation. And it gives you basically visibility between receiving and exit gates that you've never had before. This is still a fairly abstract concept, this idea of clearing the fog, and we'll get into more detail about what we mean specifically by that. But it's helpful to understand some of the key differences between barcodes and RFID technology, just from a capability standpoint. For one, RFID technology is not a line of sight technology. You don't have to be able to see the tag to read the tag. In addition, there can be multiple tags in the read zone at a given time, and the RFID reader can easily talk to and read data from each of those tags, unlike barcodes where you really have to do one at a time. Some other strengths of RFID is that it has long range. You can read the tags from several feet up to a few meters away in a retail environment, and some other applications for asset tracking, you can even read them in 10 to 15 meters away. And the data on an RFID tag is serialized. Each tag has got unique data on it, and it can be secure in many different ways. Some of the challenges, I think the main challenge that we're here to talk about today, is to understand what the value is for your business and how to make that decision to go forward or not with RFID in a retail application. And I say this because, unlike barcodes, the RFID tags are not free. They do cost a little bit of money, and so you'll want to understand what the return on investment and the business case is for going forward with this technology. I think it's a useful vehicle to talk about something that I learned in college called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a psychological concept that says that you can't really worry about your higher level needs until you've addressed your lower level needs. And just as a simple example, until you have food, water, and shelter and warmth, you're not going to worry so much about your safety. I think it's kind of fun to compare that to a retailer's hierarchy of needs, in which at the very base level, you have to have products that people want. And whether you have products that people want, or you can get people to want the products that you have, that's the same thing in my opinion. But that's the baseline. And RFID doesn't really help you a lot with that, although in some levels that there actually may be some feedback loops and visibility that do help with that. That's not really the point. We're assuming that you're already very good at that as retailers. That's how you've built your business. And RFID is really all about what happens after you're already very good at doing this first requirement in retail. The second level that I would say is really essential is this notion of execution. If you already know what people want and you're able to have good merchandising and get the right products to the store, it's all about whether the store can get those products on the shelf and make them available to their customers in ways that they're willing to buy them. And to get execution, it's not very complicated. You need to get a tag onto your garments, and you need maybe something like a handheld reader that can easily take inventory and do more frequent in-store counts to increase the visibility of what's happening on the shelves. Moving up the hierarchy, once you have basic execution under control, then you may want to think about loss prevention, and that would require additional hardware, for example, something at the point of sale to deactivate or remove a security tag, as well as detectors at the exit gates. Now, RFID is different in loss prevention than traditional EAS technology because you have direct visibility to what's actually leaving the store. You don't just know that an alarm has been triggered, you actually know if it's been 5 shirts or a very expensive pair of jeans that's leaving the store at that time. You can sync that up with camera activity so you can actually look and see who took that particular pair of jeans, things that you could never do with a traditional EAS technology. Finally, at the top, nearing the top of the pyramid, you might use this technology to improve the customer experience, where you have interactive displays in the fitting rooms that know what the customers have taken in, and you can upsell or cross-sell in that way. We have several partners that are working to use RFID for a more seamless consumer experience. And I think it's important to point out that RFID is being used for virtually all of these applications, yet it's always true that the baseline deployments start with this notion of execution. And so we'll start by talking about the business case that's addressed by the execution and leave the discussions of these higher level applications, loss prevention and customer experience, for another day. So just to be clear, more clear now about the business case and what we're going to drill into in a bit here, is to look at different models of retailing and fashion. On a replenishment model, you're dealing with fairly low-priced items that may sell. You may have many turns a year of the same SKU that you carry over time, and that turnover over the course of a year in a replenishment business model leads to distortion, leads to lack of clarity on what's actually on the shelf at any given time, because your physical inventories only occur once or twice a year. Contrary to that, in the fast fashion world, here we have time to the sales floor being the most critical factor. If you only have a 2-week selling season and the item sits in the back room for 3 days, then you've just lost a significant percentage of your selling season for that item. Now, that's if you're running a store and you're a store manager, that's pretty much under your control. But if you have a chain of thousands of stores and you're sending out fashion items to thousands of stores, how are you going to, back at headquarters, know how each of those stores is executing against your plans with respect to getting that stuff to the floor? So if we look at our stylized store again, one way to think about the business case for visibility for execution in RFID is to look at it this way. You may know from your distribution operations that a store has been provided a certain item. And you also may know from point of sale data that they haven't sold it. But what you don't know really is the reason for that. Is it because it's not properly displayed? Is it because it's in the back room? So what our RFID adds to the mix is that aha ability to know what the reason is for poor performance in the store, or better yet, for great performance in a store. So let's step back now and say, how do we get that basic level of visibility and execution visibility out of RFID? And the first thing, of course, is you have to add RFID, and we say at the source, but the reality is it's at a piloting stage. It would be very sensible to even apply these tags at the distribution center for just the set of stores where you're going to be running the pilots. We've shown 3 different kinds of tags here. We have basically a simple adhesive label that carries an RFID tag inside. It's just an antenna with a chip attached to it. That can go anywhere. It can go on the back of a price ticket. It can go on the back of a piece of cardboard trim, and it doesn't even have to carry printed information. We have a more traditional swing ticket that would carry printed information. It might be a point of sale tag or a branding element that carries the RFID inlay inside, or it could be a hard tag, a security tag, that instead of being a traditional EAS tag that only triggers an alarm, may actually carry an RFID chip and inlay that can be read from for inventory purposes, but also serve a function as a security tag. And you have your choice as a retailer of which way to go. Once the tags are on the item, it's straightforward. You have your employees with a handheld, possibly something like this one from Motorola, scanning items on the shelf at whatever frequency you think will deliver the most benefit for you. It could be daily, it could be weekly, or even monthly. And you might consider also having other read points instead of having a handheld on the shelf, or in addition to, because that's always a baseline requirement. You may have something at receiving, you might have some gates at the front store to back store to front store transition, or even exit gates and point of sale readers for other higher level functionality. But for basic execution, it's been pretty well established that handhelds in the stores are adequate and can give you quite a lot of benefit. The question being, how would you make, one of the questions we're going to discuss in a bit is how would you even make a decision about what level of functionality to put into your operations? And once you're reading this data, the key then is to bring that data into your operational inventory as SKU availability. You don't have to worry about the fact that these are serialized tags. It's still essentially UPC data. You now have updated operational inventory cycle counting on a weekly or periodic basis that gives you better visibility and insight into how your stores are doing. It can be that simple. So if you were to say to yourself, how would you decide, when I talk to retailers, maybe that's a better way to go about it, when I talk with retailers about how they make decisions to go forward with the technology or not, there's really three different ways of doing that. One is to figure out what's happening. Stick your head up and look around and see what's going on out there. And I think what we find is that when you when you scratch the surface, you find that there's a great deal of activity that isn't necessarily obvious. For example, we know that there are about 100 projects on the public record for RFID and retail globally, covering things mostly apparel, but jewelry and other categories as well, jewelry, footwear, cosmetics. And we also know that the active retailers represent close to a third of the total U.S. apparel market. That doesn't mean that they're tagging a third of that. 1/3 of the U.S. market is not tagged today, but the retailers that are engaged in active pilots or significant pilots with a significant scale represent a significant portion of the U.S. apparel retail market. And we know that billions of items will be tagged in 2011 for that market. And I think one of the other exciting developments recently is that the push for adoption in this technology has shifted significantly away from the traditional technology providers like Impinj, or even more technology-oriented organizations like GS1, towards the industry representatives. And I've listed VIX, AAFA, RILA, and GS1 as 5 major groups that have gotten together to form a coalition to facilitate adoption of this technology across item level retail, starting of course with an emphasis on apparel. And we've listed some of the major retailers who have shown a significant interest in efforts and pilots along these lines. So I think it's safe to say that RFID is well along the adoption curve in item level apparel retail. So the next, of course, approach is to do some ROI analysis. And I present this as it's sort of a standard way for retailers and any business really to get their head around what the value of a new way of doing things might be. And so I just show sort of the first page of a spreadsheet that indicates you put in some parameters about your business, and then you add those parameters, you add some more information like for example, what your wages are, what your capital expense might be for a given deployment, what the tag costs, the incremental tag costs will be, how more frequently you're going to do your counts, and how much faster you can do your counting. You put those in, and here's some typical numbers that you might see that's been well established by research at the University of Arkansas, that counting speed with RFID can be as much as 25 times faster than it is with barcodes. And as a consequence, you can count more often, and you can do it with store employees on, as catch can basis, and actually not spend any more on counting, or maybe spend less, but you get more data and more usable data. So, but you'll see though, what's clearly enough is that you don't really make your money back on the operational side. You're counting more often and more frequently, and you're paying for a tag, you've got some capital costs. So the business benefit all comes in through increased gross margin because you have reduced out of stock, you have reduced markdowns as a consequence of better inventory management, increased revenue because you have a lot lower incidence of avoidable out of stocks. And you can define avoidable out of stock as, let's say, a scenario where you've got the item somewhere in your supply chain, maybe even in your back room, but it's not in the front of the store where it needs to be to meet a customer coming in the door. Or you have a reduction in shrink as a consequence of the fact that employees are now much more careful about theft, about internal theft, because of the visibility that's now available to the management. You take all this together and you get some kind of ROI. And I should call out, let me go back a step and call out that the actual spreadsheet that we're using is provided by RFID Journal. It's called the Fashion Retail ROI Calculator. This has been vetted by research at the University of Arkansas and really rolls into a single spreadsheet a lot of the learning that's been done over the past couple of years in this technology, and it's a great tool. But despite the fact that it's a great tool and can give you a suggestion of what your return on investment might be, given some assumptions about operational differences as well as business performance, it does have some limitations. And so because of those, one of the main limitations that I would talk about would be the question of whether or not this applies to your business. So yes, this data comes from real pilots that have been published, and yet you may say that, well, our business is different from those companies. We may have a smaller back room, or we have a different kind of supply chain arrangement, or our business is more oriented towards fashion, less towards replenishment. There might be a variety of reasons why you would question possibly whether this spreadsheet, as it is off the shelf, applies exactly to your business. And another one might be, how do operational inputs that we've put here relate to performance? So for example, if I were the CFO of a retailer and you showed me this presentation, I might say, well, gosh, 10K per store gives me a 5% revenue uplift. Can you give me a more expensive solution that's 15K per store and I get even a higher revenue uplift? What's the relationship between my investment and my revenue? And how do you tie those things together? Really what we're saying is these inputs are just assumptions, and you may still have the question of, how do I really know what I'm going to get when I deploy this technology? Done, it may be a bit of a surprise and maybe novel in the retail business, is taking a look at the use of simulation as one way to get a handle on some of these questions. The other way, of course, is to run your own pilot. And what we really want to strongly recommend is that you combine some of these ideas we're going to show you with the idea of piloting and getting those results that you might want. And there's many companies out there and places to go to implement low cost and effective pilots. And if you're interested in learning more about options for doing that, please give us a call, and we will certainly talk with you about the options that are available. So with that said, I'd like to share with you some thoughts on simulation. Simulation has been proven to be a very effective tool to understand and draw conclusions about complex systems. And if there's nothing, if retail isn't a complex system, I don't know what is. But also a hurricane is a very complex system, and what we've discovered over the years in the scientific community is that simulation is a great way to draw big conclusions about what the aggregate outcome will be of lots of simpler interactions that happen every day or every few seconds. And so for example, we may have customers coming into a retail store and making decisions, individual decisions about whether to buy something or not, and then walking out. And if we can change the conditions for managing inventory and run those conditions forward in different ways, we can see what the impact is on the net revenue of a retail operation. And that's what we've done with simulation in the store. So we'll look at what we mean by simulation, how it's different than the traditional ROI spreadsheet. So instead of, for example, having these business performance parameters such as revenue uplift or markdown reduction be the inputs to my model, what I'm starting with my inputs are some more basic information, things that you really ought to know about your business. For example, from an operational standpoint, I would expect to know basically what my merchandise looks like. How many SKUs do I have? How much inventory do I expect to have for each SKU in the front store? How much in the back store? How often do new SKUs come into the picture, and how often do they go out? In other words, what's my balance of replenishment versus fashion? And how many shoppers do come into my store on an hourly basis? And what is the nature of those shoppers? How likely are they to buy something from me? You may not know the exact numbers for these inputs, but you probably have a better sense of those parameters than you would for what the sales uplift will be for having RFID on your shelf. How often do you restock from backstock inventory? And how often do you reorder from your DC? And how long does it take the goods to get here? So you can see that we're, instead of modeling presumptions about the benefits of RFID, we're modeling how your store operates. And then we say there's some other issues that we want to take into account, which is things like distortion. Distortion being what causes the items on the shelf to diverge from what your merchandising plan says ought to be on the shelf. So for example, if I want 6 larges, 6 mediums, and 3 of everything else on the shelf at any given time, and I go into my store and I actually look on the shelf and I have 2 larges and 2 mediums and 5 smalls and 5 extra larges, that's distortion, especially if you don't even know that that's the case. So that's another major input to this model. And then there's this idea of loss rate. As a percentage of sales, how much just disappears from my shelves for various reasons. Those are other sources of distortion. The counterpoint, or the thing that counteracts distortion, is visibility. And that comes to how often do you count and how accurate are those counts. So what we're doing is we're saying that in the barcode world, we're not really talking about the technology anymore. We're talking about visibility. And in the barcode world, we might say that we count once every year or twice every year, and that our accuracy, let's say it's very high, just for give the benefit of the doubt to the status quo, which is 99%. And then another take on visibility might be in the RFID world. We have a frequency of twice a week, and our count accuracy is maybe a little bit lower just because we're having store employees do it, and we actually want to allow them to be a little bit less careful. The question will be, even under those conditions, what would be the net outcome from our business? We combine that with some financial information, like what are the average sales price of our products that we're selling. I think that in the retail world, it's more, there's a different term for that, AUR. There's the gross margin for those items, assuming that we have perfect sell-through and we don't have markdowns. What are the wages, and then what's the carrying cost for those items? Because we have a different carrying cost maybe for the front store than we do for the back store. And the reason that's important is that one of the things you might compare RFID to is what happens if I just carried more stock, and we want to make sure that we're having the proper expense for doing that. And then we have a tagging cost, of course. So as a consequence, we set all this stuff up. We let virtual people come into our virtual store and look for virtual items on the shelves. And if they find them, they buy them. If they don't, maybe they look for an alternative. And if they don't find that, they finally walk out of the store disappointed, or they actually buy something. And as a consequence, we can show what our fulfillment percentages of that demand that's coming into our store, what's our revenue, what's our effective margin improvement. We run that into a spreadsheet with our capital expense for enabling RFID or not, and we get some kind of an ROI or shareholder value that comes out of that. We're also able to look at some of the operational things, like what's our accuracy of a PI? How well does our what we think is on the shelf match what is actually on the shelf in our simulated world? And also, how well does what's actually on the shelf match up with what we want to have on the shelf, our merchandising plan in this virtual world? And then we're calling that stock conformance. So this is a really nice, powerful tool for putting yourself in the driver's seat of a retail operation, thinking like a CFO, and figuring out what's going to happen when I change my parameters in my model. So I'm going to throw up a few parameters here. And what we're showing is that you can kind of scan through and read these parameters on your own. We're restocking once a day. We're reordering every 3 days, and there's a certain delay. I've got 10,000 SKUs on my shelves with 500 shoppers a day. My restocking error, and this is very important, is 10%, meaning that when I have 100 items to bring from my back to my front, I'll get 90 of those items right. I'll get 5 items I don't want, and 5 items that I do want aren't there. So I have a plus and minus 5%, which leads to a 10% restocking error. Some of my items are stolen, and we can run these parameters under 3 conditions. One being our baseline condition of barcodes twice a year, 99% accuracy. And then we have 2 other conditions: a weekly RFID scan that's, let's say, at 95% accuracy, and a monthly RFID count at maybe a slightly improved accuracy, because maybe I have a person in my business dedicated to going around and doing monthly inventories, and I'm looking at the trade-off between higher accuracy and less frequent versus less accuracy and more frequency. And by the way, you may actually be able to combine both of those kinds of approaches in a real deployment. So now that I've spent a lot of time explaining how this model works, let's just take a look at some of the results. And what we've done effectively is run this virtual store for 9 different scenarios, which means 9 effective years of store operation, and it takes 20 seconds for the simulator to crunch through all of those conditions. So just as a reminder, our virtual store has 30,000 items on the floor. Actually, in our first set of scenarios, we have 3 groups of 3 scenarios, and I'll explain that in a minute. The first group is what we're calling our understocked situation, where we have 3 items of each SKU, so 30,000 items on the shelves in the front, and we have 1 item of each SKU in the back. So we've got a little bit of back stock, a 1 to 3 ratio. We have our overstock condition, where I have 3 items in the front, still, because my front store can't expand and contract, but my back store can. So I have let's say 5 items in the back. And my sort of optimal, we'll call it our optimal scenario, where I have 3 in the front and 3 in the back. So I just run my barcode world. Let's look at the blue bars first. I run barcode under those 3 different stocking conditions, and what I see is what you would probably expect, which is that I have a certain revenue level, let's call it 9.5% or a little bit less, on my understock condition. And as I go to a improved stocking condition, I'm just by adding backstock, my revenues do go up. And what that shows is that as the same set of customers come into my store in each of these 2 scenarios that I'm comparing here, and they have the same set of things that they're looking for, because we are replenishing from the back with some level of accuracy, we're more likely to be able to satisfy that customer demand because we've got the stock in the store rather than having to wait for the DC to ship it every 3 or 4 days. So we do see a revenue uptick. But what we also see here is that as I increase my back stock, I get really seriously diminishing returns on having more back stock, and I think that's consistent with what people expect. You can't really sell stuff out of the back. I would also point out that if I were showing you, this is just revenue, if I were showing you marginal profit as a consequence of adding this back stock, you would see that there's almost no marginal profit. All of this extra revenue gets eaten up by the significant carrying costs of these 2 extra items per SKU that you have in your store all the time. And then so now that's the baseline that we're talking about. Now let's turn on RFID. If I don't add any more stock and I turn on RFID instead, you can see that I almost get as much revenue uplift as I do by adding 2 items of back stock. And in fact, what I get is not only more revenue uplift, and if you look more closely at the data behind this, you actually see more profit in this scenario than you do in this scenario. So I think that's an important thing to take away, is that RFID really gives you more effective access to that back stock and may change your thoughts on how you think about that back stock. But so then the third scenario here is monthly RFID, and what you can see here is that I'm running the same scenarios, but now I'm just counting once a month slightly more accurately, and you can see that gets me almost all of the benefit of RFID in each scenario. So some of the takeaways that you might consider here is that we have diminishing returns on increased backstock. That's very clear. And another neat thing is that if we took this simulation and let's say we have 2,000 items in the store, we have 2 items per SKU instead of 3, and we let our backstock go to infinite amount, so we're never constrained by backstock. Because of the diminishing returns, in both scenarios you end up with, without RFID, you end up maxing out at 8.5 million in revenue. But if you add the RFID with that infinite backstock, you end up at maxing out at 9.5 million revenue, a whole extra $1 million, a whole about 10% improvement in revenue potential out of that 20,000 unit store. And I think that's a really compelling result. So the other thing that you might say is, well, gee, why is the monthly doing so well? And that's going to demonstrate the power of this simulation capability is by showing you what happens when you sort of look under the. And so if we now take just one of those scenarios and look in it more deeply, actually 2, we're going to compare that optimal stock scenario, the 3 items in the front, 3 items in the back, with barcodes and with RFID weekly, to look at how some of the operational performance indicators look differently. So in both scenarios we have a seasonal shopper profile where sometimes we have as many as 800 shoppers in the store per day, and sometimes we have as few as let's say it looks like 300 shoppers in the store per day, with an average of 500, and I've got 2 busy seasons a year and 2 quiet seasons per year. So now let's look and see what happens. And by the way, we're going to show you a blue and a yellow scenario. Like I said before, the blue is RFID, blue is barcode, and the yellow is weekly RFID. So let's take a look at a couple key performance indicators here. The first one is stock conformance. And what we're showing here is how the items that are available on the shelf diverge from the merchandiser's plan. And the merchandiser's plan in this case is very simple, 3 of everything. So as we operate the store, because this replenishment error accumulates and loss error accumulates, what's actually on the shelf may be different from what we think is on the shelf, and actually may be different from what we want to have on the shelf. And so what we see is that because of the way errors accumulate in the barcode world, our on-shelf availability diverges from the plan by as much as 30% over time. But because we're doing RFID weekly, and with some level of accuracy, let's say we have a 5% counting error, we seem to level off at about a 10% error in conformance. And the only other major difference here is that the tag costs 10 cents in this case, and it's free in the blue scenario. So what does that do to our ability to fulfill demand as customers are walking in the store looking for something to buy? And what we can see is that in the RFID world, our ability to fulfill demand stays fairly constant, but in the barcode world, it degrades over time to the point at which we're having a fairly significant amount of disappointment as we get into those out months. And that might give you a little bit of an insight too as to why that monthly count seems to be fairly effective, because it's the out months that really kill you as your on-shelf availability starts to really diverge. In the simulations we've run, we're showing a 5% revenue increase with half a point lower gross margin. I guess that's not really clear what that means, so we might want to explain that in more detail. The gross margins actually do go down a little bit because you've got the tag to pay for, but your net profit goes up significantly as a consequence of having RFID. And this margin difference, by the way, is inclusive of any tag and counting costs that are incremental to running your operation. So we can drill a little more deeply into this by looking at what happens when we compare the weekly RFID to the monthly. And this is just sort of validating the insight that we got before, which is that it's very interesting reflection here, and I'll get to that in a second, is that when we run the weekly versus the monthly, what we see is what we saw before on the weekly is we have a fairly consistent conformance over time. When we're doing it monthly, what we're showing is that in our quiet times, when the store's not busy, a more accurate, less frequent count actually does a better job of maintaining stock conformance to the plan. However, in those busy times, it's very clear that the rate of degradation of the rate of distortion accumulation is so high that a weekly count really does make sense. And so what this would suggest to me is that a hybrid model where when you're busy, you're counting more often and perhaps less accurately, but when you're less busy, you might want to count less often and more accurately. And that's kind of a neat insight that the simulation can give you that you may have discovered or felt is true in your gut, but not been able to really demonstrate without running a very fancy pilot in a physical store. So another thing that I kind of wanted to share with you is that many people think of retail is a fuzzy business. You're dealing with real people every day, operations, store associates. It's complicated, and the idea of maintaining very accurate inventory and operational data suggests somewhat fighting against the grain, which is that you're going to try to get people to do things that are not necessarily natural, to count more often and do things that are difficult to do. And what we found in the piloting, some of the recently reported pilots, even from JCPenney, that they were called out as a company that actually does a very good job in the barcode world of maintaining that kind of data and having good discipline and good process in their stores. And yet even they found it to be somewhat of a losing battle. When you add RFID and the insight that less accurate counting can still be very valuable, what you find is that this is actually a better technology to match up with what the world is really like. And the reason is that by doing more frequent counting, even if it's less accurate, you serve to fix errors that you've made on a very rapid basis. So instead of requiring people to be better and more careful, you can actually let them be more natural. And what this chart shows is that as we increase our error rate for replenishment, the barcode world profits degrade very aggressively as a consequence. But in the RFID world, when you can still have a high replenishment error, people can make mistakes. They can just grab stuff off the shelf and bring it forward. And because you're counting every week, you're fixing those errors as you're making them. And so the profits and revenues in an RFID supported retail operation do not degrade the way they would in the presence of floppiness in a non-RFID environment. And I think that's a very important thing to consider about the difference between RFID and not having it. So I guess as a way to close, I would like to invite you to leverage the investment that's already been made in this technology. There's been several hundreds of millions of dollars invested in this technology. It's a real commercially viable technology that's being used, as I said before, in a wide variety of applications. I think there's a wide range of possible deployments and how to think about this from a business case standpoint, depending on how your business works and operates. So we'd encourage you to talk to us about these tools that we might be able to bring to the table to help you, and maybe to think about where you might go to and how you might go about starting pilots and making the right decisions there. And overall, I think that RFID serves to herald a new data-driven environment for retail, and I would encourage you to not replace data-driven concepts with what you've already been doing well, but complement your retailer gut instinct and knowledge about your customer with data-driven methods that can really help you perform in the real world. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from many of you.